The house was alive with sound. Children's laughter spilled through the narrow hallways, bouncing off the walls like sunlight caught in glass. Their footsteps were quick, their games endless, and every corner of the home seemed to carry the warmth of their joy. At night, when silence finally settled, my wife and I would sit in the kitchen. The kettle whistled softly, steam curling upward like fragile threads of hope. She would smile across the table, her eyes glowing with a tenderness that made me believe no darkness could ever touch us. "We'll grow old together," she whispered once, her fingers brushing mine, "no matter what comes." When our first child was born, I felt the world shift. Her cry was sharp, alive, and I thought, this is the sound of meaning. Then came the second and the third, each one a universe of their own. One was restless, curious, forever tugging at the edges of mystery. Another was gentle, dreamy, her heart tuned to the quiet beauty of the world. The youngest was silent, watchful, with eyes that seemed to carry secrets too heavy for a child. But fate is cruel. The youngest was diagnosed with an incurable illness. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, their words heavy with inevitability. "There is little hope," they said. Yet we refused surrender. We poured every coin, every ounce of strength into treatments, into hospitals, into prayers whispered in the dead of night. I remember holding her tiny hand as she trembled in pain, whispering stories to distract her from the needles. "Daddy," she murmured once, her voice fragile as glass, "don't let go." And I promised her, with all the weight of my soul, that I never would. Through it all, I believed the struggle had bound us closer. My wife's tears fell silently, but her resolve seemed unbreakable. We were a team, fighting against the merciless tide of fate. Together we searched for answers. Together we endured sleepless nights. Even in despair, I felt her presence beside me, and I believed our love was the shield that protected us from collapse. The house, despite the shadows of illness, remained a sanctuary. The children drew their dreams on the walls with crayons, filling the rooms with color. We cooked together, laughed at small mistakes, and found joy in the simplest things, walking under the rain, telling bedtime stories, holding each other close. Money was scarce, but happiness seemed abundant. I thought this was forever. I thought nothing could break us. It began with silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles after children fall asleep, but a silence that pressed against the walls, heavy and suffocating. My wife no longer lingered at the dinner table. She ate quickly, her eyes fixed on the plate, and left without a word. At first, I told myself it was exhaustion. We had carried the weight of our youngest's illness for so long that perhaps she was simply worn down. But the silence grew sharper, edged with something colder. The children noticed before I did. "Daddy," my middle daughter whispered one evening, tugging at my sleeve, "why doesn't Mommy laugh anymore?" I forced a smile, though my chest tightened. "She's just tired, sweetheart." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. Nights changed. She no longer sat with me in the kitchen. The kettle whistled, but she ignored it. Instead, she stared at her phone, her face lit by its glow, her lips curling into faint smiles that were no longer mine. I asked her what was wrong, but her answers were clipped, sharp. "You don't understand me anymore," she said once, her voice flat. I wanted to argue, to remind her of the nights we had fought together for our child's life, but the words died in my throat. The children began to cling to me. They sensed the absence of her mother's tenderness. Our youngest, frail and trembling, asked one night, "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy hold me anymore?" I swallowed hard, my heart breaking. "I love you," I whispered. "She's just distracted." But even as I said it, I felt the lie burn inside me. Then came the signs I could no longer ignore. Late nights out, unexplained absences, whispers on the phone when she thought I was asleep. Her laughter, once mine, now belonged to someone else. One evening I confronted her. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice trembling. Her eyes met mine, cold and unyielding. "Someone who makes me feel alive." The words cut deeper than any blade. I stood there, shattered, while she turned away. The children watched from the doorway, their faces pale with confusion. I wanted to shield them, to protect them from the truth, but the truth had already seeped into the walls of our home. The house, once alive with laughter, now echoed with silence. The drawings on the walls seemed faded, the colors drained. Even the air felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of betrayal. I knew then the glass of our family was cracking, and soon it would shatter. The silence had grown unbearable. It was no longer the quiet of exhaustion, but the silence of absence, of something already gone. One evening I came home to find her packing. Clothes folded neatly, children's toys gathered in bags. My heart froze. "Where are you going?" I asked, though the answer already burned inside me. She turned, her eyes cold, unyielding. "I can't do this anymore. I don't love you. I haven't for a long time." The words struck harder than any blade. I stood there, shattered, while she turned away. The children watched from the doorway, their faces pale with confusion. I wanted to shield them, to protect them from the truth, but the truth had already seeped into the walls of our home. The house, once alive with laughter, now echoed with silence. The drawings on the wall seemed faded, the colors drained. Even the air felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of betrayal. I knew then the glass of our family was cracking, and soon it would shatter. The house had become a mausoleum of memories. Toys lay abandoned. Photographs stared from the walls, their smiles mocking me. Only one voice remained, the fragile, trembling voice of my youngest, the child born into pain. Hospitals became our second home. The sterile smell of disinfectant clung to my clothes. The hum of machines became the rhythm of my days. I sat by her bed, watching her chest rise and fall, terrified of the moment it might stop. Doctors came and went, their words clinical, their eyes heavy with pity. "We're doing everything we can," they said, but I knew the truth. There was no cure, only borrowed time. I held her hand through every spasm of pain, whispered stories to distract her from the needles. "Daddy," she whispered once, her voice fragile as glass, "don't let go." And I promised her, with all the weight of my soul, that I never would. I held her hand as she trembled in pain, whispered stories to distract her from the needles. "Daddy," she murmured once, her voice fragile as glass, "don't let go." And I promised her, with all the weight of my soul, that I never would. I held her hand as she trembled in pain, whispered stories to distract her from the needles. "Daddy," she whispered once, her voice fragile as glass, "don't let go." And I promised her, with all the weight of my soul, that I never would. The nights grew longer, the hospital colder. Machines hummed their endless rhythm, but I knew they were only delaying the inevitable. My daughter's strength was fading. Her voice, once fragile but steady, had become a whisper barely carried by the air. One evening, as rain tapped against the hospital window, she looked at me with those deep, knowing eyes. "Daddy, don't cry when I go." My heart shattered. I wanted to scream, to beg the universe for mercy, but I forced a smile through the tears. "I'll be strong," I said, though I knew it was a lie. She reached out her trembling hand, and I held it tightly. Her fingers were cold, her breath shallow. "You're my hero," she said, her lips barely moving. And then, with one final exhale, she was gone. The room fell silent. The machines still beeped, but they no longer mattered. I sat there, holding her hand long after the warmth had left,
unwilling to let go. The funeral was small, quiet. Rain fell as if the sky itself mourned her passing. I stood alone beside the coffin, my other children clinging to me, their eyes wide with grief. And yet, she did not come. My wife, the woman who had once sworn to love us all, was absent. She had chosen another life, another man, and abandoned the child who needed her most. As the earth covered the coffin, I felt a part of myself buried with her. But in that moment of unbearable loss, I also felt something else: clarity. Love had betrayed me in the form of my wife, but love had also saved me in the form of my daughter. Her words, "You're my hero," echoed in my mind.